Very pleased to be back. Hopefully you've enjoyed your lunch. Please continue to enjoy. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's guest, the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor of Economics at Harvard University, Ed Glaeser. Excuse me, Ed Glaeser. I stuck an N in there. That's why I've got to put my glasses back on. Ed Glaeser combines the warmth of a humanist and the rigor of an economist to deliver deep insights into city life and Americans' urban landscape. He studies the effects that cities have on innovation, society, and the environment. His rigorously researched conclusions frequently challenge commonly held assumptions about urban and rural areas. Ed's view finds powerful expression in his book, Triumph of a City: How Our Greatest Invention Makes Us Richer, Smarter, Greener, Healthier, and Happier. Now that's a book to read. In his most recent book, which is Survival of the City, Living and Thriving in Age of Isolation, was co-authored with David Cutler. Ed has taught at Harvard University since 1992, and today, as mentioned, he's the Fred and Eleanor Glimp Professor at the Department of Economics. For 10 years, he was also the director of the Taubman Center for State and Local Government, and the director of the Rappaport Institute of Greater Boston, which are both at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He's also written many essays for the New Republic. Much more to say, but what I'd like to do now is ask Ed to come on up to the stage so he can share some more remarks with you. And again, after we'll take some questions. So with that, thank you, Ed. Welcome.
Thank you, and it's fantastic to be here. Is mics on? Can people hear me? Great. I am a huge fan of Indianapolis, which I think combines the sort of two secret ingredients for urban success in America, which is a relatively pro-business, stable environment, and an understanding that human capital is the bedrock on which local, national, and individual economic success rests. I'm going to start with a couple of facts that were true across America up to 2020. I'm then going to talk a little bit about what I understand to have changed over the last 5 years. And I will then end with what I think that means for what policies need to be in place to helping this region thrive. First, in this figure, I've taken the 3,000-odd counties in the United States, and I've ordered them on the basis of their density levels. Because at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people and firms. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. Each one of those dots represents about 300 counties, and the bottom line shows the relationship between density and earnings. The densest tenth of America's counties have earnings that are 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This is something economists call agglomeration economies. The fact that we become more productive, more innovative, wealthier when we are enmeshed in a maelstrom of economic activity. The top line, the red line, shows the relationship between population growth and density. And what you can see from that is that whereas Americans at the start of the 19th century were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're clustering in. Second fact, the rise of the consumer city. So if we think about the past, if we think about the 19th century, America's cities grew as places of production. But in an increasingly wealthy, increasingly well-educated world, cities rise as places of consumption, places of amenities, places of fun. Dr. Samuel Johnson famously said in the 19th century that when a man is tired of London, he is tired of life, for there is all that there is that life can afford is in London, right? And he's still right. London is still an amazing city. And the price of that, of course, is the rising willingness to pay to be in cities like London. And you can see the sort of very steep increase in prices in the densest of our metropolitan areas, in the biggest of our metropolitan areas. And those price increases, which are both a sign of demand for cities but also an urban failing, that's a reflection of how much people want to live in cities because those prices are going up a lot faster than wages are going up. Next fact. American success has become very uneven. I thought before COVID that America's largest unsolved social problem was the rise of prime-age male joblessness, right? So when I was born in 1967, about 5% of prime-age males didn't work. For most of the last 20 years, 15% of prime-age males didn't work, right? And so this is a really huge change. And I focus on men rather than women because typically when women aren't working, they're actually working. Okay, they're taking care of their family, they're taking care of their parents, they're taking care of their kids, they're doing lots of stuff with enormous social value. Typically, like you may have read on the New York Times an article about like some wonderful male house husband who's like taking care of stuff. That's like one guy, okay? That's like one guy. If you look at all the data, like the guys who are not working are not working. I mean, it's not like they're watching TV, they're going slowly. And it's associated with massive amounts of misery, okay? Associated with opioid abuse, it's associated with suicide, it's associated with families breaking up, and it's very spatially concentrated, particularly in the Eastern Heartland, which is a band which starts down in Louisiana and Mississippi, runs up through Appalachia, and ends up in the cities of the Rust Belt. But that, of course, brings us up against COVID. So those are three things that were true in 2020, where we could paint a picture of relatively vibrant, dense areas, the triumph of the city, and then all of a sudden, our offices emptied out. And then all of a sudden, we were social distancing for a while, hopefully not very much. I'm really glad to be with you in person. And the question is, what's happened? So the first thing that I did to try to make sense of this was to try to look across metropolitan areas at which areas seemed to be winning and which areas seemed to be losing in the post-COVID era. And I did this by taking 4 measures of urban success: housing prices, employment, earnings, and permits. And I just scaled them and I averaged them in a sort of a stupid way, and I just created an index of the 50 largest metropolitan areas. And I'm going to show you this. This is the top 25. You can't read all that. Austin, Texas leads the list. Phoenix follows it. Tampa, Miami, Salt Lake City are our top 5. Indianapolis comes in at 12th, so you're in the top half of the top half, which is kind of remarkable. And then this is the bottom half, which combines places which are sort of on the bottom of any urban list any time over the last 100 years, like New Orleans, right? There's never a thing in which New Orleans doesn't end up close to the bottom. Baltimore as well. But, San Francisco, which as of 2020, you would have said this is an urban superstar, right? But it's had a very rough 5 years, in part because the same tech skills that made it so powerful prior to 2020 are also the things that made working from home the easiest. Right? And so at the start of COVID, 68.9% of Americans with advanced degrees were working remotely. You know how many high school dropouts were working remotely? Less than 5%. Right? So skills loaded very heavily on this. And consequently, you see both highly skilled places and long-term places having problems. Okay, so how do you understand this? In some sense, remote work is just another transportation technology. It's a transportation technology for ideas rather than for bodies. But cities have always been shaped around transportation technologies. All of America's urban system built up around transportation technologies in the 19th century. Every one of the 20 largest cities in America in 1900 was on a major waterway. The oldest, typically where the river meets the sea, to the newest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. Right? And over the course of the 20th century, we had this incredible centrifugal age where cars made those former advantages of being on the port, being on the rail yard, made it largely irrelevant. And so we reshaped our world around the automobile. Indianapolis is very much, both symbolically and in reality, a child of the car, right? I mean, I've never seen as many lanes on a highway as the road I took coming in from the airport yesterday. Truly extraordinary. And there are lots of advantages of building around the car as well. But many older cities had difficulty, and in some sense, we were freed up from those older links, and we could move wherever people wanted to move. And what we learned is that people really wanted to move where it was warm, because there's no variable that better predicts metropolitan area growth over the course of the 20th century than January temperature. Now, that's multiple things. That's the fact that warmer states are more likely to be right-to-work states, right? So they're relatively pro-business. That's the fact that warmer places tend to make it a lot easier to build. Right? You don't understand why Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, Phoenix have all added a million people a decade for the last 30 years without understanding how easy they make it to mass-produce housing. This is also a strength in Indianapolis as well. But of course, let's face it, it also reflects the fact that Americans just don't like icy Januaries. Now, as a person who has raised 3 New England children, I think it shows a lack of character on the part of America. But that being said, it is what it is. Okay, but 40 years ago, Alvin Toffler was writing, and he predicted that just as New York City's garment industry had been hammered by container ships and by trucking, right, he predicted that information technology, fax machines, computers were going to make knowledge workers in cities obsolete. They were going to cause all the offices to empty out. Right? And for 40 years, he was completely wrong. And the reason for that, I think, is that what information technology did is it radically increased the returns to being smart. It radically increased the returns to innovation. And we are a social species that gets smart by being around other smart people. After all, that's hopefully why we're all here today, is that we actually think we learn stuff from being around other people. These are two images associated with that. There's, well, now the images are gone. Please put the images back. One of which is the Wallace office at Bloomberg LLP, which is based on the Wallace office at Bloomberg City Hall, which is based on the Wallace office at Bloomberg's company, which is based on the Salomon Brothers trading floor. And if you think about trading floors, there's something weird about them. Because here you have some of the wealthiest people on the planet, right, who are, you've got no offices. They're on top of each other. They're sweating on each other. They're yelling at each other, right? Why are they there? Because they're in an industry in which it's a little bit of information can make you a billionaire overnight. Right? And in their industry, knowledge is vastly more important than space. And so they're willing to put up with the inconvenience of that so that they have, have this proximity and the knowledge that comes from it. In some sense, that's a metaphor for what happened to cities. Right? Knowledge became more important than space. And so people were willing to put up for the inconvenience in order to learn more. That's the Googleplex campus. And if information technology was making proximity so obsolete, why is it the most famous geographic cluster in the world today is Silicon Valley? Right? Why is it that Google buys the Googleplex? Why is it that there were all these investments to make sure that people were on top of each other all the time rather than spread about? It's because they thought that's how innovation works. 1971, 50 years ago, two guys put up a billboard on the highway leaving Seattle asking the last person to leave the city to please turn out the lights. Because Boeing had been cutting back on jobs, and just as no one could imagine a Detroit with a smaller General Motors, no one could imagine a Seattle with a smaller Boeing. Before Amazon, before Costco, before Microsoft, before Starbucks, right? It did come back. It came back because of skills. It came back because of entrepreneurship, right? And so, industrial change is not destiny, but ideas and entrepreneurship are. And of course, this is Cambridge, this is MIT, this is the other image, right? A city that was supposed to be doomed because the candy industry was dying. Can you imagine how can Cambridge survive with a smaller candy industry? Necco wafers will no longer be made in Cambridge, right? And yet, here we have an area which has come back marvelously as a capital of the information age. Skills do seem to be destiny. This is share of the population with a BA and subsequent employment growth. This is share of the population with a BA and earnings. This is not just that your skills make you more productive. This is that your neighbor's skills make you more productive. As the share of adults in your metropolitan area with a college degree goes up by 10%, your earnings also go up by 10%, holding your years of schooling constant. This is something economists call human capital externalities. And I think all of you know this, that having smart people around you is just a great way to make you more productive. This is an amazing fact, which is education and death rate from COVID, taking over the entire COVID duration. So you're not surprised that it's negative. Education loads always positively on health. But it's a fourfold difference in COVID deaths between the least educated parts of America and the most educated parts of America. That is an amazing fact to me. Now, remote work. We're learning more and more stuff about remote work. And I'll just give you the type of fact that seems to be emerging is like this fact of Emmanuel and Harrington's, which is when you send call center workers home, they are just as productive at making calls, maybe more so. Some of Nick Bloom's original work on this finds actually increases in your ability to the number of calls you make. But both studies find a more than 50% reduction in your probability of being promoted if you go home, right? And it's not surprising. How would your boss learn that you're good at taking difficult calls if you were home? How would you learn how to take those calls if you were home? Right? And so the thing that feels tragic to me is the 25-year-olds who think, oh, I just want to be able to dial it in from Starbucks. Right? That's just stupid. You're not going to learn how to be the kind of skilled person that you should want to be unless you're around people that you can learn from. And I think that will ultimately make the case that people are going to be back at least some number of days. So what does this mean for urban policy going forward? I'm going to argue that, in fact, economic policy is quality of life policy. That, in fact, the right thing to be doing is just to try to make sure that your area is as attractive as possible for smart people, right? I have a mantra which is attract and train smart people and then get out of their way, right? Which is not an easy thing. It requires good schools. It requires fast commutes. It requires decent housing. I was very worried, which is why I wrote my book, Survival of the City, that we had this confluence of things which reminded me of the 1970s, which is a progressive desire to right all the social wrongs that were there in cities. And there were social wrongs, both in the 1970s and today, and they should be righted. But if you try to do that by taxing the rich and by taxing local firms, they just run away, especially in a world in which Zoom has made it easier to run away. And so that means if we're going to right social wrongs, we need to make government better, not just by shuffling it and raising taxes on particular groups. And so the most obvious way that you make government worse is just by deciding that policing is optional. And there were a couple of places like Seattle that decided that. And it's just obvious that running open-air fentanyl markets in your prime tourist areas is just not sensible government policy. Okay, I think often the lowest hanging fruit is regulatory. It is amazing how poor our measures of entrepreneurship are. And still, they show such a strong correlation between entrepreneurship and subsequent economic success. So this is average establishment size in 1977 and employment growth over the next 33 years, right? Unbelievable effects within metropolitan area, across industry, however you want to cut it. Small firms make for successful areas. Now, it is an outrage in this country that we regulate the entrepreneurship of the rich so much more lightly than we regulate the entrepreneurship of the poor. If you want to start your internet phenomenon in your Harvard College dorm, you can have 1 billion users before any regulator knows you're alive. If you want to start a grocery store 3 blocks away that sells milk products, you have 16 licenses you need to get. Right? I'm particularly excited about freeing the food truck, which is a particular favorite of mine. And if you ask me about food trucks, I have a good food truck story, but I'm going to move on now. But food trucks are a natural example of one of those things which are overregulated. Housing, I'm going to move, because I don't think this is your problem, but housing supply is a big deal, and it helps you understand America. And what you see over there is along the horizontal axis, the x-axis, is how much building there was between 2000 and 2013. Along the vertical axis, the y-axis, is how much more expensive it is to buy than it is to build. And what you should take away from that is that the places like Las Vegas and Austin and Raleigh that build a lot aren't expensive. The places that are expensive don't build a lot. Okay? There's no repealing the laws of supply and demand. And if Indianapolis is going to need to stay affordable, right, it's going to need to continue building. Right? And that growth is both vital for the region and vital for the nation as a whole. Being smart about infrastructure. Singapore has had electronic congestion pricing for the last 50 years, charge drivers for the congestion that they create. It's a sensible policy for them. It's a sensible policy whenever you have congestion becoming a real thing. The really important thing sort of politically to know about this is if you take streets that are now free and you start putting charges on them, you get a revolt. Right? If you provide a new highway lane, you can always put a new charge on that because it's a new thing and people don't feel like they're getting stuff taken away from them. So if you are delivering new highways, which you do, think about putting on a congestion price from the beginning so you have the possibility to control things later on. Similarly, if we ever do get autonomous vehicles, right, put a charge on it immediately. Because one of the things that's really dangerous about autonomous vehicles is it reduces the cost of sitting in traffic. Right? And you know what happens when there's a lower cost of sitting in traffic? More people sit in traffic. Okay? One of the things that frustrates me, there are a lot of things about government that frustrate me in the US. If our subway costs are 4 times the OECD average to build a mile of subway, the average American transit agency spends $1.05 million per electric bus. You can buy a lovely $350,000 electric bus from Kia. So we're paying 3 times the global market price for electric buses. And even worse, we're doing a terrible job of taking care of our roads. So I have, courtesy of Uber, I have all this, millions and millions of rides for 1 month in the US where I can measure how bumpy all those rides are. And I can do things with that. But one of the things I can do with that is for the cities where I have repaving data, I can look at whether or not the cities are repaving the rougher roads first. And in 8 out of the 11 cities that we have data, there's no correlation between how rough the road is and its probability of being repaved. We are repaving the smoother roads just as quickly as we're repaving the rough roads. And when you think about sort of making Indianapolis more attractive without increasing taxes, right, figuring out how to repave the right roads first is just a very sensible thing to do. So I will just end where I began, which is a picture of a Sunbelt superstar. I think this is Austin. And just reminding you, Indianapolis doesn't exactly have Texas weather, right? That's sometimes a good thing. That's sometimes a bad thing. But it does have a great tradition of really sensible government, and it has great institutions in lots of different ways. And those things are your strengths. And as long as you're focused on how this city can still deliver stuff for its ordinary citizens, how it can be sort of a human-centered place that everyone would want to come to, right? That's the recipe for long-run success. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for caring about the economy of Indianapolis.
Thank you so much, Ed. That was fantastic. Another round of applause for Ed. Thank you. I'm going to get us started with just a few questions, but again, feel free to ask questions and we'll have people collecting them. But I think the first question, of course, is the food truck story. Tell us about that.
Okay, so I had written an article on freeing the food truck, because I've eaten in food trucks outside my office for the last 33 odd years, and I want to give back. I want to give back to the food truck stuff. So I write this article on freeing the food truck, and I get myself on an NPR call-in show about this woman who had been trying to start her food truck in Detroit for the last year and a half, okay? It was called the Pink Flamingo, with the G was capitalized. And the idea that Detroit is saying no to any entrepreneur, right? I mean, this is 15 years ago. It just seemed completely nuts to me. But especially this nice, appealing person who's just trying to bring a food truck. And we're on this NPR show for an hour, right? And you've got the host and the woman and me and the ombudsman for the city of Detroit. And everybody's beating up on the ombudsman for the city of Detroit. There's nobody. Every caller is how can you be such a terrible place that won't let this lady serve her nice food, right? And I'm beating up on him, and the host is beating up on him, and the woman's beating up on him. And this poor beleaguered guy, you've got to really feel for him. And at the end of the day, right, he just sort of phase. He says, "Oh, lady, please just start your food truck. We're never going to catch you."
Thank you. I know a lot of other inquiring minds wondered as well. A question from the audience. So this is toward the housing affordability. Is hedge fund acquisition of large quantities of scattered site single family the problem? And if not, what is? And if so, what's the fix?
No, it's not a problem. It's not a problem in any way, shape, or form, in fact, the hedge fund purchasing. It's a relatively small amount, so it's certainly less than 1 million units, and that remember that's less than 1% of the housing stock of America, so it's a tiny thing. Secondly, what the hedge funds are doing is they're primarily converting owner-occupied into at least temporarily rented units. I don't see that as a problem at all. Typically, poor people tend to move into these units. They become more racially integrated. We actually have data on this. So I don't see any reason why we need to stop investors from moving things around and taking response to market fluctuations. Moreover, let's remember when this thing got started. I mean, presumably some people remember what 2007 was like. Right? We had a huge glut of newly produced houses. A bunch of private equity people figured out how they could use these owner-occupied units that were meant to be owner-occupied and convert them to rental in efficient ways, right? By basically standardizing all the appliances, having trucks going around and take care of it. It was smart American entrepreneurship, and it meant that the cratering of the housing bust was much less painful and severe than it could have been. So I am not on board that. I'm not even bored that it's a problem. I mean, I actually think it's American entrepreneurship doing good stuff for ordinary Americans, not that this is something that we should be in any way scared of. What is the problem? The fact that we've made it too difficult to build, right? The fact that there are too many permits and that we've regulated the process of building, not just entry to building. So most of the time when we think regulation, you think sort of, oh, the Ford Motor Company has some regulation, they need to do some compliance. The difference with housing is we're regulating, it's like every Ford car had to go through its own special approval with some individual body that gets to say, oh no, we want it to be like this rather than like that, right? That's how we do housing in this country. And consequently, right, we have this just amazing decline in the amount of new production and amazing increase in the amount of building, right? I think, the most magic way that you could make houses a lot cheaper is you had as of right for certain styles of prefabricated homes. Right? Indiana is a great producer of modular housing, right? It's a place that could benefit it. I actually know that Indiana is exporting to Chicago's Public Housing Authority homes that are being built here. But that's the sort of extreme version. But the more that we make it easy to sort of mass-produced housing, or at least not mass-produced and get our permits within 3 weeks rather than 3 years, right? That's a huge plus. And I will just add just some international evidence on this. So Japan has different zones, but they have like 9 different zones in the entire country. And so you can choose which of those zones you want to be if you're a locality, but you don't have to invent your own zone. And what that means is that they actually have a modular housing industry that's national, because you know that if house A is okay in zone 6, it'll be okay in zone 6 anywhere. And so you can have this sort of mass-produced thing. And so I think really it's about making sure that there are rules that are transparent and simple that enable the sort of virtue of scale economies and mass production to work.
Thank you. So one of the questions from the audience is, if quality of life is economic development, as you've shared, how would you advise the economic development industry, meaning the entities and people who are involved in economic development, should change to meet that need?
Well, I think the largest mistake that mayors make, and you know why they make it too, because this is how they get headlines, is to focus on the whales. to focus on, oh, if only I get company X to move their headquarters here, that will make my life. And you saw this in particular with like the Amazon, throwing out their possibility, you can be the second Amazon city, right? Which caused every mayor in America to drop everything else that they were doing and try to compete for this thing, which was just crazy, right? In part because, for many, many reasons. And really the right thing is to make sure you're a breeding ground for new companies, not that you're going to pull in the whale. Right? And that's the first thing. And you want to sort of change how you're thinking about, is it easy to start a firm here? How many steps can I take out of the permitting process? Can I create one-stop permitting? Right? So even if I need to go to these 3 different agencies, can I have one entity that's the entity that the businesses speak to? Right? All of that stuff seems worthwhile. Secondly, on the permitting side, what am I doing around permitting for things that make Indianapolis fun? Right? Have I made it as easy to start your food truck? Have I made it as easy to start your cafe, to start your whatever it is? I, maybe 15 years ago, chaired a citizens committee with the president of the Boston City Council to try to sort of make Boston more fun, which is not an easy thing, let me tell you. And it turned out that what the kids were all upset about was the fact that they were paying New York prices and not getting New York fun. And the first thing that they wanted was the ability to take public transit after 11 o'clock at night. And so, talking to people and figuring out what it is that they actually value is always sort of sensible. And there's a lot that we can do around new technology in terms of improving the quality of government that we weren't able to before. And so that's another thing, like figuring out where the roads are crappy and need to be repaved.
Several questions on affordable housing, which you've covered as well. Can you just talk a little bit more about what you think cities can do to drive more scale for affordable housing, and then how you balance the varying opinions on what we have today and what we need into the future, and what's the right answer?
So I think there are two normal arguments against building. One of which is typically historic preservation, which I'm the son of an architectural historian, so I have some sympathy for that. But I think that there's not a huge amount of any American city that needs to be that protected. So choose some number of buildings that you want to protect and just leave it at that, and just decide that these are the part of Indianapolis that we're going to hold sacred, and we're not going to have an ever-expanding reach of historic preservation districts like they did in New York City. And the second is the sort of environmental thing. And I think most of the time, environmental opposition to building is actually bad for the environment. And I want to sort of make this case by sort of talking about coastal California, which has had some of the most draconian environmental rules against building anywhere in the country, right? Starting with the Friends of Mammoth case in 1973, which requires an environmental impact review for any new major project, private or public. Now, the crazy thing about this is if you cared about global warming, right, or you cared just about carbon emissions, the California is by far the most naturally green part of the country, just because of the weather. Okay, just because their Januarys are mild, their Julys are mild, and so they require a lot less heating and cooling stuff. So if you were sort of a sensible environmentalist, you'd say, bring it on. Let's build as much as we can on the San Francisco Bay, because this is the place where we're not going to get carbon emissions, right? On top of it, they have a BART system, they have a transit system. But of course, the opposite is far too often the case. And what's sort of missing in the calculus is, they're sort of thinking, if I turn off the building, it's going to go away. But it doesn't go away. If you turn it off outside of San Francisco, it gets turned on outside of Tulsa. It gets turned on outside of Phoenix. It gets turned on someplace that it's a lot less environmentally mild. And so both of these reasons, I think, are not very good reasons for being opposed to making it easy to build. Now, communities want some control over what they're having. And I think there's some right to have that. But the more that you can make your rules clear up front, the better off everybody is.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to transition a little bit to a different topic on AI. And so a question from the audience. It starts with an insight, which is interesting. The insight being many view skilled trades as being AI-proof, but as robotics and AI overlap, this may not be true. And then the question is really, how might planners forecast and plan for the change? And is your view that it's smart to protect the human jobs, or is it smarter to just lean in and promote the change?
I think, by and large, we want our governments to be technologically neutral on this, and not to think one thing or the other. We do want lots of technological change. It's called pain for people, so we want there to be some kind of a sensible social safety net, so that we're not people aren't suffering the worst impacts of it. I think from where I sit, AI is so unpredictable that I wouldn't want to be basing any large-scale government policy about it, because I just don't know where it's going to be in 5 years, and I don't think really anybody does. I think it's sufficiently hard to forecast. It's just very hard to know what's going to go on. It's likely to be disruptive in different ways. It already has been, I mean, above all in coding. Whether or not it'll increase jobs or decrease jobs in coding isn't entirely obvious because you're making each worker more productive, which has two effects. You can displace some workers, but also you want to hire more workers. So I don't know. I do tend to believe that general education is useful and lots of different things. And so the story that we have from the deindustrialization of cities is, if you think about Detroit in 1970, right, it's not that Detroit didn't have skilled people. It had tons of skilled people, right? But the skills were very Detroit-centered, right? The guys who ran the assembly lines at GM, they knew how to do amazing things, but that was very specific human capital. The difference with the engineers and their kids in Seattle was they had general human capital. They had skills that had been learned in schools that were relatively easy to adapt to something else. And I think the one lesson that I take away from this for education, for vocational training, for anything, is you want to think about the more general your skills are, the better off you are.
Thank you. Okay, another topic. So many topics for urban issues. Roads. Let's talk a little bit about roads and infrastructure. The comment is rural counties have smooth and well-paved roads with very little use compared to the heavily traveled roads in Indy, for example. And those roads are not. They're much more traveled and not is in good shape. So the question is, what are your thoughts on how to help the state make legislative change and priorities to address that challenge?
So, figuring out the right pace of repaving is a difficult question, and it sort of depends on, you need to put in how much you value cash now and a bunch of different things. Figuring out how to, the value of repaving the rougher roads first, that seems obvious. So no matter how often you're going to repave, you certainly want to target it towards those roads that are particularly well used and particularly rough. So we can get better on that. We can use technology to get better on that. I mentioned congestion pricing, but there's one variable which predicts how much abuse roads get, and it's trucks. Right? It's not your car that's destroying the roads, it's the big trucks. And making sure that we're charging our big trucks enough to compensate for the social costs of their roughness, that's a sensible thing to do, and it's actually politically doable because you're not actually imposing costs on ordinary drivers, you're imposing it on the trucks who are going on it. So I think the most natural thing, and again, I'm being sort of the economist who wants to take away the punch bowl and sort of throw cold water on everything, but like prices are good. And sort of you want to charge people, you want to charge truck drivers who are destroying roads for the cost of repaving the roads.
So how about another question on quality of life? What is one investment in quality of life in a city that you think is surprisingly underrated but very impactful?
That's a great question. If I thought about what I would, the most valuable things are things that enable entrepreneurship, so like one-stop permitting, and stuff around public safety. So screwing up public safety is just a really big way, easy way in which you can let things go awry. And so things which, and often the public safety doesn't necessarily require cops, right? You can have sort of local security paid for by business improvement districts, but sort of that's that's probably the lowest hanging fruit. So things that sort of make it possible for you to walk the streets without looking over your shoulder, and things that make it possible for people who have good ideas in urban space to get started, that feels really central. And I will highlight also one of the things to take away from that graph of male joblessness across America is that in a well-functioning city, there always should be entrepreneurs who can figure out what people with less formal education can do, right? Because there always are people with sort of highly valuable time who are eager to have somebody else do something creative for them and make something easy for them. And you want to just make sure that that's happening here in Indianapolis, that creativity that sort of figures out how to match different types of people so that you get those new deals, that feels great. Of course, the corollary of that is it's much harder to figure out what the future of less skilled people in West Virginia are.
Well, a little bit of a segue then. A couple of questions came in on education, and I'll start with the first one, just speaking to the impact of investment in education, particularly K through 12 and higher ed, and how that correlates to the economic development impact on a region.
Lots of evidence that higher ed does relatively good things for the region. So both in terms of wages, so those places that the work of Enrico Moretti from 2003 documents fairly clearly that having a land-grant college in your area prior to 1940 is very predictive of wages today. So our land-grant college in Massachusetts is MIT, which has been pretty helpful. Also, having a land-grant college or having other forms of university very productive of patent innovations, especially after the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which made it possible for you to use federally funded research and commercialize. And so the work of Naomi Hausman shows that in industries where you had research that was relevant going on in the university, there's like an effervescence of creativity after 1980 when you allowed that. So that's a second spillover. Of course, you can also have just the sheer advantages of having the school nearby to sort of provide help for, I directed these two centers for a decade whose mandates were really to try to improve quality of local government in Boston. And those are other things which can come out of universities as well. So I think there's a lot of upside in higher ed. But then, of course, I'm talking about my own industry here. So take it with a grain of salt.
One more question on education, and I'm going to read, this is from the audience, the comment, and then share the question, maybe a little bit of a provocative question, if I'm reading it right. So we didn't repeat 1929 in 2009 because we were better educated on what not to do. For example, the housing issue created the collapse. This audience member says, I see a world where we glamorized non-educated, and the questions are, will education save us in the future, and do we really want a better educated populace? That's the question. Somewhat of a provocative one, but I'll ask it.
So, to quote from Animal House, I affirm that knowledge is good. I think the ultimate, now, there's a lot of silly things which happen in higher ed in America today. So unquestionably, when I'm asked about things that are happening in Cambridge, my view is this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to try to fix some things that are not great at Harvard right now, and shame on us if we don't fix those things. And so that's how at least I see it. So I'm not in any sense trying to say that we haven't done some foolish things in higher ed. But the basic mission is great. And the basic mission of trying to create more knowledge, trying to spread knowledge is a deeply important thing for America. I think it is, in terms of the glamorization of non-knowledgeable people, I think it's important for people not to look down on other people. And I think the educated elites on the coast have done themselves no favors, either in terms of how they're viewed politically or in terms of their, their honor, their immortal soul, whatever you have, by acting as if virtue is only found within a university, which is utter nonsense. I'll just say something that's particularly awful to me, is when someone who lives as coddled a life as I do, being a tenured faculty member in a nice university, says that we can't have a ROTC program on campus because they're going to look down on soldiers. I find that so offensive that it's, that's a thing I hope that never gets repeated in American universities. So I'm not saying there isn't a need for reform, but I think basically embracing education, embracing, and if I will say it, my model for the educational reformer of the last 20 years is Mitch Daniels, who I think did an amazing job and provides a model for education that's just unbelievably great.
Thank you. What do you see as the role of cities in addressing the foundational problem of wealth inequality in the U.S.?
Okay, so it was Plato who said that every city of whatever size is in reality two cities. One a city of the rich, the other a city of the poor, and they are perpetually at war with one another. That remains true, but it's actually not a sign of urban failure. It's typically a sign of urban success, because cities have really rich people, because cities are kind of fun places to be rich, right? As Dr. Johnson's quotation about London seems to suggest. And cities tend to attract poor people because they're relatively less painful places to be poor. As long as cities are continuing to serve their role as escalators, where people can come with less income and become richer, then they're doing the historic mission, and that's what they're supposed to be doing. Now, unfortunately, we have a slew of evidence from my colleague Raj Chetty that suggests that too many of America's cities are failing in this. So cities are still doing great things for adults who come, right? You can just see when people come to cities, it's not just that their wages go up immediately. It's that year by year, month by month, they experience faster wage growth. But kids, and Raj particularly looks at the generations born around 1980, and then he connects them with with themselves 40 years later. And kids who grow up in city centers do worse. Kids who grow up in denser neighborhoods do worse. Kids who are on just this big city side of the school district as opposed to right outside, they do a lot worse, right? And so just cities look bad for kids. Now, as someone who grew up in a dense part of Manhattan in the 1970s, I found this all vaguely troubling, but it's fundamentally the data is sort of hard to walk away from. There is a question about why this is. My own hypothesis, and the cell phone data seems to bear this out at least somewhat, is that adults who live in relatively segregated low-income parts of cities still live relatively integrated lives. They go to companies, they go to places that lots of different people live in. They're part of an urban economy that's actually pretty integrated. And there's really pretty good evidence that working around people who are more skilled than you does great things for your long-run wages. Whereas kids, poor kids, who wake up in a housing project. They go to a segregated school. They play in a segregated park. They live, very isolated lives. And I think it's really the difference is how integrated, how much economic mixing there is in the city between adults and kids. And I think the central thing is to sort of have an agenda around trying to improve the upward mobility for American kids. I spent 10 years, as I said earlier, on the advisory panel for the Gates Foundation's domestic branch, which is very focused on using schools to do that, which I believe in. But it's just proven to be incredibly hard to move the needle on schools. So I'm really excited about things like vocational programs that wrap around traditional schooling, that provide, the ability to learn other skills. And I think the really important thing with this is to go in there with the humility to learn, and not to think you know the right answer to go in, but to go in and try things and make sure you rigorously measure them using randomized controlled trials, and then the stuff that works, you scale up.
Okay, we have time for just maybe 2 more questions. One is about the airport. What do you think about airport systems and how they might correlate to positive economic development?
Well, airports are important, right? Connections throughout the world are cities in the 18th century, like cities today, succeed because of, small entrepreneurial firms. They succeed because of smart people, and they succeed because they're connected to the outside world. Cities are nodes on our global lattice of travel and trade. They're the points of entry for everything. And so these connectors are really important. So I will say, unbidden, I was having breakfast with former Mayor Steve Goldsmith yesterday, and he was lauding how great the Indianapolis airport was to me, so I trust, and certainly my experience yesterday was pretty great here. So I think that almost assuredly that's a thing you want to make sure continues to work. I will throw out another interesting fact about private equity, though, and airports, which is the work of Sabrina Howell shows that actually when private equity firms take over airports, they actually function a lot better. So actually and just to be clear, I'm not a shill for private equity. When private equity firms take over healthcare systems, it's a disaster. Okay, so systems where you actually really want a business to be running it, that's good. You really don't want them taking over areas where if you cut costs, you're going to put people's lives at risk in a meaningful way. So, airports are important, and you seem to be doing pretty well here.
Well, the last question, and this is the close, just so many insights and so many different topics. Could you just leave our audience with what gives you optimism for cities like Indianapolis into the future?
390 people are willing to come here today to talk about the future of Indianapolis. This room gives me optimism. I think that absolutely. I mean, this region has been full of the sort of pragmatic, good sense, governmental innovation things which have, kept this region strong for many decades, and I think we'll continue to keep it strong in the future. And as long as you recognize there's no Republican or Democratic way to pave a city street or to clean up a sidewalk, and we sort of stay focused on the things that are delivering quality of life to ordinary people, right? Which Indianapolis has done for many decades. As long as you keep on doing that, you'll be just fine.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate it.